Okay, I think we're ready to go. Happy anniversary, 50th anniversary, Title IX. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Latta, and I am professor and chair at Manhattan College in the beautiful Bronx, New York City. And I am a proud alum of Springfield College and a past president of the National Association for Girls and Women in Sport. And it is my honor to introduce Donna Lopiano. Dr. Donna Lopiano is the president and founder of Sports Management Resources, a consulting company that focuses on scholastic and collegiate athletics departments in solving growth and development challenges. Dr. Lopiano is the former chief executive officer of the Women's Sports Foundation and was named one of the 10 most powerful women in sports by Fox Sports. The Sporting News has also listed her as one of the 100 most influential people in sports. She's been nationally and internationally recognized for her leadership advocating for gender equity in sports by the International Olympic Committee, the NCAA, NAGWS, the National Association of Collegiate Women Athletic Administrators, and the National Association of Collegiate Directors of Athletics. Recognized as one of the foremost national experts on gender equity in sport, Dr. Lopiano has testified about Title IX and gender equity before 3 congressional committees, served as a consultant to the U.S. Office for Civil Rights, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, Title IX Task Force, and as an expert witness in over 30 court cases. Dr. Lopiano has also served as a consultant to school districts, institutions of higher education, and state education agencies on Title IX compliance, and to domestic and international sport organizations on program development, governance, and strategic planning. That's not all. As an athlete, she participated in 26 national championships in 4 sports, and I think Coach Potter just said, how many times did she strike you out? A couple. And was a 9-time All-American at 4 different positions in softball, a sport in which she played on 6 national championship teams. She's a member of the National Sports Hall of Fame, the National Softball Hall of Fame, and the Connecticut and Texas Women's Halls of Fame, among others. Yeah? Enough? Okay. I had to do due diligence. I mean, I had 2 more pages, but Dr. Mangano was a very good editor. This interview with Donna Lopiano is one of the many events celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title IX as part of the Springfield College Title IX Commemoration Steering Committee. Included in the celebration, Distinguished Professor of Humanics, Dr. Kathy Mangano's project titled Title IX and 50, Educate and Advocate, focuses on educating our college and the greater community about this important civil rights law that provides access and equality in education. A second component of the project encourages the community to advocate for the preservation and strengthening of this important law. So thank you, Springfield College, for honoring Title IX, and let's get to the questions, Donna. So what were women's sports like pre-Title IX, so pre-1972?
As Sean was doing that generous introduction, all I could think of was this story, which I've told with every speech I've ever given since I was 18 years old, that my biggest dream in life was the one thing they wouldn't let me do, which was to be a pitcher for the New York Yankees. And the most devastating experience of my life was trying out for Little League Baseball, getting selected number 1 in the draft, and then being told I couldn't play because I was a girl, and this was well before 1973, when that law, a law was passed that would enable us to do that. But it was like that. You had to fight for. You had no role models. I was just saying to Diane that you had nobody to look up to. So you didn't have heroes except for mine, which were Mickey Mantle and Don Larson. There were no women heroes. You were lucky if you played high school sports to have a basketball season of 10 games if you were lucky. There were no college athletic scholarships. You had to earn your own money to buy uniforms. There was no such thing as an athletic department. Athletics were run by PE teachers who were passionate about sport, who were never paid for being a coach, never paid for being an athletic director. But if it weren't for them, women would have never played. So it's a very different space.
I didn't realize that both of us had short careers in Little League, because I also lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I went to Little League baseball practice with my brothers. And my mother was like, Sean, they don't allow girls to play Little League. And I said, okay, I'm just going to shag balls behind the backstop. And that's what I did. And then a coach said, geez, who's that girl? She's good. And then I played one game. I struck out 3 boys in a row, and I was banned. And I still have the game ball. I still have the game ball in my office.
That's why you were banned.
Yeah, I still have the game ball. So oftentimes people think, oh, Title IX, it's an athletic law. They don't really understand that really wasn't the intent behind when Title IX was passed. So maybe you can talk a little bit about Birch-Bayh and Mitzi.
Title IX was passed in 1972, and it had nothing to do with athletics. It had everything to do with the fact that my grandmother could never get into law school, could never get into medical school, could never dream to be an engineer or get into a graduate program that produced the most well-paying jobs in the country. So Title IX was all about the quotas that then existed in graduate programs. Quotas like 10% of any incoming class in any of the professional schools. And everybody thought at the time, why are we wasting our education on women? They're going to be in the job market for 2-3 years. They're going to get married. They're going to have babies, and they're going to waste this education. And everyone believed that, except for Birch-Bayh and Edith Green, who were the sponsors of Title IX in 1972. And it wasn't until 1974 that anyone even realized the law applied to athletics. The law firm for the NCAA, one of them in Washington, D.C., asked the Department of Education, which was then the Department of HEW, Health, Education, Welfare, asked whether or not Title IX applied to extracurricular activities. And the answer was yes, and all hell broke loose. It was the headlines across the country. Darrell Royal, who is the equivalent of Saban at Alabama in terms of the football coach of the day. He was the president of the American Football Coaches Association, and the headlines across the country were Title IX and women's athletics will be the death of big-time football. And that's all the media would cover for 10 years. And it was a myth that anything bad would happen to football, as you have noticed. But it was always painted that this was going to be a zero-sum game. If you gave women a chance to play, you were going to take something away from men. For every dollar that went in that direction, somebody would lose. And the data shows that that doesn't happen in capitalist societies. Everything grows when things are successful. And that's exactly what happened. Just to give you, a data point, in 1972, there were about 3.2 or 3.4 million boys who played high school sports. Today, there aren't even that number of women who are playing. Boys have 4.7 million opportunities to play high school sports. So women still haven't caught up to where boys were in 1972, and boys have continued to increase their opportunities to play. So it's never been a zero-sum game, and we've got to be careful not to let that kind of a myth exist.
You see those same numbers in collegiate athletics,
Oh,
that
absolutely.
men continue to have more opportunities than women, even though, there was that fear that women would take away male opportunities.
Yeah, over the last 10 years, whenever sports get added, sports get dropped. But there's no question that more opportunities have been added for men in college sport than for women. And one of the reasons is when schools say, oh, I have to expand opportunities for girls, they do some nefarious things, like instead of just having cross country and track, let's have indoor track. Same girls are playing, but let's give them another season and count them another time. Or picking the sport that has the fewest number of girls, or a sport where girls can play in large numbers, but the last half of those numbers are not given the same opportunities as the real starters because of inflated teams. And rowing was the sport of choice for many, many years. A typical rowing program, team of 45. If you look at average team size now of college rowing, it ranges anywhere from 80 to 90 women. And it's just, at the beginning of the year, the rowing coach, stands on the green in the middle of the college campus and takes anybody and says, my athletic director said I needed 20 more girls. So it's a different standard for men and women.
So when they're the beginning with more and more varsity intercollegiate teams, and it was the AIAW that first oversaw women's athletics, which organized out of NAGWS that both of us have been involved in. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those early days with the AIAW overseeing women's athletics and why pretty quickly the NCAA, I think the word that they use in history is co-opted the AIAW so that the NCAA would oversee all of women's athletics.
Yeah, not to go backwards from that, but I think you have to give credit where credit is due. Women have opportunities to play sports today because of female physical education teachers. There used to be separate sex physical education departments in all schools, at the high school level, at the college level, and the most powerful women on campus were the women in physical education. They were the chairs of faculty senates. They existed as department chairs in their own right because of that separation and the equality of academic departments. And they were the ones that said there shall be sports for girls, while the boys were over there not run by male physical educators, but by outsiders who came in and saw the entertainment value of men's sports. So it was the women of AFERD, the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance, and it was the Division for Girls and Women in Sports, which was a part of that professional PE organization that was responsible for starting CIAW, which was the predecessor to the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And the actual starting of the national championships was through DGWS. And DGWS realized that they had to have an organization in which institutions could be members, that a professional association for physical education teachers wasn't going to be supported by higher education. And that's why the corresponding organization to the NCAA, an institutional membership association for intercollegiate athletics for women, kind of happened in 1973. And there were some real strong women who were those initial presidents of that association and who really rattled the Title IX cages. AIW died in 1981 because they had become too powerful. They were the ones defending Title IX. They were the ones who were able to mobilize the National Women's Law Center, American Association for University Women. They had friends in Congress, Ted Kennedy, notably, in addition to Birchby. But they were well connected, they were powerful, and the only way that the guys really could win in terms of controlling the growth of women's sports was to take over women's sports. And they did so by a very simple, what I call, which was the basis for the antitrust suit that AIW eventually brought against the NCAA. They said, if you come over here, we are going to pay your full expenses to national championships. AIW didn't have the resources. Every school paid their own way to state, to regional, to national. And who was running women's sports? By 1975, women physical educators had lost their separate departments on campuses. They were thrown into the athletic department, which was the men's athletic department, who was the athletic director, the male athletic director, and that was the control point for women's sports. Instead of the women physical educators saying which national organization are women going to belong to, it was the male AD. And the male AD who had to fund women's athletics said, where's the money? And that really was the root of the demise of AIW.
So since Title IX was passed in 1972, I mean, early on, I mean, once people realized that it could be applied to athletics, very quickly there were challenges to Title IX. And, you know, I use the example of the Tower Amendment. Maybe you can talk a little, the Grove City decision, where Dr. Mimi Murray, I was here as a grad student, and she came into class wearing all black with the black hat. It was a sad day in 1985. And there's Dr. Murray in the back. And then luckily in 1988, we had the Civil Rights Restoration Act. But maybe talk about the Tower Amendment and where, you know, some of the men were getting a little agitated.
They were more than agitated. And I had a really personal experience with the Tower Amendment. I was 29 years old when I went to the University of Texas at Austin as its first director of women's sports. And that's a story in and of itself. The reason why we had separate athletic departments and women's sports wasn't under the control of men's athletics was because then president of the American Football Coaches Association, Darrell Royal, said, I don't want to fund women's sports. I don't want to be responsible for fundraising for women's sports. I'm not going to do it. And he was the most powerful person on campus. So they started a separate women's program. There were 9 schools in the country that did this. All of them really took off in terms of women's athletics because of passionate leaders not coming second to men's football or men's basketball. Iowa, Tennessee, Minnesota, you just tick them off. Who were the most well-known women's programs in the 70s? And that's why. But so here I was, 29 years old, went to Texas, and I was there for 2 weeks, and I get this phone call. And there's a woman on the line, and she says, Donna, this is Laureen. And I said, Laureen. I was just there for 2 weeks. I said, am I supposed to know Laureen? She said, Laureen Rogers. I said, oh, President Rogers. This is the president of my institution, right? I'm there for 2 weeks, and I say, oh, I'm so excited to be here. We're going to have a great women's program. I was this naive 29-year-old or whatever, and she said to me, she said, I understand you're going to Washington, D.C. So about 3 weeks before this phone call, I get a call from the AIW attorneys, Margot Polivy, and they said, can you get us a copy of the men's athletic budget? There are going to be hearings before Congress, and we can't get a copy. There were no open records laws then. We can't get a copy of their budget. And what did I say? I said, oh, I know Darrell Royal. Of course, I can get that. So I run across campus, right? And Darrell's coming out to go to football practice. He was the AD and the football coach. And I said, Darrell, can I have a copy of your budget? And he said, sure, ask Betty, my secretary. She ran the show. Went in, got the budget from Betty, faxed it. There was no FedEx or anything else. Faxed it to, no internet for that matter. Faxed it to DC. And about 2 days later, I say, can we have a copy of your budget too? I said, that's easy. It's on one page. Darrell's budget was $4.5 million, and mine was $90,000. 20 was my salary. 10,000 was scholarships, all we spent on, and the rest of the money paid all other coaches' salaries and all other expenses of women's sports. So I sent my one page, and then The next day, call, how would you like to come to Washington, D.C. and testify before Congress? And my first thing was, wait till I tell my mother. My mother and father are going to be so proud. And so that's the background of this phone call, right? And I was there to testify against the Tower Amendment, which was to eliminate basketball and football. And so Lorraine Rogers is on the other line, and she says, I'm just checking. She says, do you know who John Tower is? And I says, I do. He's the senator from the state of Texas. And she says, good. She said, he is also best friends with the chairman of the Board of Regents of the University of Texas. And I said, are you telling me I can't do this or I shouldn't do this because, you know? And she said, no, I'm just going to tell you how to keep your job. And thank God I had a woman president, right? She said, number one, you're going to make an appointment to see John Tower. And you're going to tell him that you are appearing as an expert witness and you are not representing the views of the University of Texas at Austin. Second thing you're going to do is when you stand up to testify, that those are the first words out of your mouth. And when you submit your written testimony, those are the first words on the page, right? Which, I did. And as it turned out, that measure, the Tower Amendment, which would have excluded from the computation of equal opportunity basketball and football, that died and has not been resurrected since. There were 4 efforts to exclude football and basketball, all to no avail. And then you're talking about the Grove City decision, and there was, Title IX is just 37 words, right? And if you are conducting an educational program or activity that is funded by federal funds, you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And nobody knew what recipient meant. No, seriously. You would think it's the institution, right? But this little college, Grove City, said, wait a minute, we don't get any federal funds. The only office that handles federal funds is my Office of Student Financial Aid. They get Pell Grants. They get those basic educational opportunity grants, right? And we administer them. So it shouldn't apply to us. And that really knocked the socks out of Title IX because there were no men's athletic programs in the country that were directly funded by federal funds. Money, came into the institution through other doors. And I was to find out later at the University of Texas the reason why Darrell Royal was so dead set against funding women's sports was he felt that the chemistry department or the engineering department should fund us because they got all the federal funds. It shouldn't be men's athletics who didn't get any federal money. But so Grove City was a case that just stood up Title IX for almost 5 or 6 years until 1988, when the Civil Rights Restoration Act passed, and that was defining recipient as the institution. If any part of the institution got federal funds, then Title IX applied to the entire institution, because all of you know that institutions are like United Funds. Nobody cares where the money comes in from. It's got to fund even the programs like English that don't make a lot of money, or Russian, or something like that. But
so you actually saw during that time when Grove City was passed that there were a number of women's athletic teams that were cut because schools knew that they didn't have to be in compliance with Title IX, which really was a shame. And there were a lot of lawsuits at the time that kind of went by the wayside. A lawsuit that my teammates and I filed in 1982 when Joe Paterno was the AD at Penn State. They mucked it up in the courts and they were jumping for joy when the Grove City, because then they could just delay it for another 3 years or whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's 50 years. Why, after all these years, why aren't educational institutions in compliance with Title IX? It's 50 years.
Because there's no enforcement arm. The penalty for violating Title IX is loss of all federal funds. And that's, like trying to kill a fly with a shotgun. Nobody is willing to take all federal funds away from, say 100 million or 200 million from an institution for a violation of a subset of a program, right? So that trigger has never been pulled, so nobody's afraid. The Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education has never been funded enough to where they could police. Think about it. There are over 2,000 programs, athletic programs that exist at the college level, and close to 25,000 programs at the high school level. They can't police them. On the average, if you look at OCR annual reports, they do 4 or 5 random audits a year, 4 or 5 of all of those. But they are obligated to investigate complaints within a pretty good time period. But kids are not willing to file a complaint. They don't want to get on the wrong side of their coach. They don't want to lose a starting position or a scholarship or have schools mad at them or the men's team mad at them. The reason why our college athletes don't speak out and why you don't see these lawsuits is that they are at the bottom of the power structure. Retaliation.
But I thought Franklin versus Gwinnett County, that lawsuit, basically said you can't retaliate.
It's true.
But they do anyway.
No, but the retaliation is artful. Think about how coaches can choose to retaliate against players. They can isolate them. They can not play them. And that's what kids are afraid of. The reason why lawsuits only get filed when sports get dropped is that kids have nothing to lose. Right? The coach isn't there their coach isn't there anymore. They eliminated their program. And all of these lawsuits that you read about are because of drop sports, not equal treatment. And all of them should be about equal treatment because you're looking at, in general, women are getting shortchanged about $1 billion a year in athletic scholarships. Easily 80 to 90% of all athletic programs are not complying with the law. You can go on, a national public database called the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act, and you can pick out by institution those who are not giving proportional participation opportunities to women, and they're ignoring it because there's no police force.
So why hasn't the NCAA and the high school federation, why haven't they been held accountable?
Well, who is the NCAA? And
college presidents.
Okay, so what's the answer? If you really did care about Title IX, as NCAA professes to do, or as high school athletic federations profess to do, you would have, as a condition of membership, that you must comply with Title IX. You can't even get in. You would also have, every 3 years, a rule that an outside third party has to come in and make sure you're compliant with Title IX. The NCAA does that now. Every 3 to 5 years, schools have to have an outside third party come in and attest that their NCAA rules compliance system is good. Right? They could do the same thing. In fact, it's been done once. The Kentucky High School Athletic Federation, at one time when it had a female executive director, and I forget her name, they passed a law in Kentucky that said that the high school athletic federation was responsible for assessing every 5 years Title IX compliance in all the high schools. And that if your school was out of compliance, you were given 1 year to fix it. And if you didn't fix it, all men's and women's teams at your school were ineligible for postseason play. That would do it, right? But the NCAA is who? The NCAA consists of all the schools that are out of compliance with Title IX. Why are they going to vote yes for a rule like that? They're not going to do it. Right now we're trying to work on Congress. We've given up on the NCAA completely. They're a trade association for people who would like to keep large salaries for coaches and ADs, but they don't care about kids.
I think many people in the room are familiar with the recent Final Four, where I think you've called it the perfect storm. The University of Oregon had their men's and women's teams both in the Final Four. And with this is where social media can be really powerful, and those images of comparing weight rooms that were set up, or I should say a weight rack for the women, an elaborate weight room for men. Maybe talk a little bit about that perfect storm.
So many things. It's so hard to predict social change. It really is. What is the catalyst that sets something off? You look at the death of George Floyd. You look at, the things that have really mobilized society. And in sport, here is this 6'7" women's basketball player, Sedona Prince, at the University of Oregon. Her friends on the men's basketball team are playing in another city, right? And they're bragging to her, oh, look at what we have. And they're showing her pictures of their weight room, and they're showing her pictures of their training table with shrimp and lobster and filet mignon and everything else. And she's getting boxed lunches of meatloaf, and she has a weight room with one set of hand weights for not even serious athletes, for fitness people, right? The little hand weights, right? The 5-pounders, right? And so not only does she share with her teammates, she puts it on social media, and it goes viral. And the NCAA is caught. They're caught red-handed. And that's what changes. But what did it change? The NCAA took a year and a half to do an independent study. They did better. They did better for the women's championship this year, and we found out lots of things that went on. Like they had valued the women's Final Four at $0, packaged it with all the other championships for $0, so that ESPN could carry it. It was estimated by the independent study that it was worth about $100 million. So, change moves slow because the people who are caught have ways to slow it down. Committees. The system takes a little longer. It has to pass through a process. And the NCAA is not to be trusted in that regard.
You also are very involved with what's called the Drake Group. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and the makeup of it and some of the charges of the Drake Group.
So after I left, after I did 18 years, it sounds like you've been in prison, right? After I did 18 years at the University of Texas, I did 15 years as the CEO of the Women's Sports Foundation, and then I opened my own consulting business. And in the year after I became a consultant, I was looking around for a nonprofit organization that I just wanted to be involved in. And there was this group of mostly guys called the Drake Group. Picture a bunch of academics in 1999 who were horrified at the firing of a whistleblower who found out about academic fraud in the athletic department. And this professor was fired because of this. So this group called a meeting, a meeting of a whole bunch of academics at Drake University, which is where they got their name, the Drake Group. And this was in 1999. And they became a very small bunch, no more than, say, 50 to 60 people were members in any one year. And they wrote op-eds. They did criticism of the NCAA. And they were the typical academics, right? We're good writers and we can be critics, but they weren't activists, right? So I joined this merry band of academics, and we decided we would become activists. And so we gave up on trying to change the NCAA, and now we work directly with members of Congress. And the reason why, if you haven't heard of it already, that there are bills at Congress right now called the Athletes' Bill of Rights, that there are now gender equity bills, that there is the NCAA Accountability Act, which would require due process be given to any athlete or institution that was accused of violations of NCAA rules. NIL reform, name, image, likeness, is because we're going, right to the people who have the power to kill the NCAA. And it's the only choice, because what Congress can do is what it did with Title IX, which was to say, as a condition of Higher Education Act funding, $150 billion a year, excuse me, to institutions of higher education, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, and this is the grand plan, you have, if you have an athletic program that generates $1 million or more of revenues each year, you have to be a member of an athletic association that has as a condition of membership compliance with Title IX. Or similar conditions. You have to pay the medical expenses of athletes. You have to contribute this amount of money into a medical trust, so that all these football players who you're exploiting, who 20 years from now are going to be suffering from dementia or Parkinson's or ALS, that there is a parachute for them, similar to the parachute that the NFL has created for its gladiators. So we need to work in that space, because the NCAA, as you know, has given up its governance authority. It voted in January that it wasn't going to govern anymore. So it gave the keys to the kingdom, the ability to write rules, the ability to enforce rules, and the ability to decide on distribution of money, gave it to each of the competitive divisions. Now, isn't that a joke? That Division I is going to police itself and is going to do something with gender equity, or is going to do anything other than what it's been trying to do for the last 20 years, which was to get the riffraff in Division II and III out of the way and to let us make money. So it's going to be interesting to see how we do in the next few years.
One of the unintended consequences of Title IX is the decrease of women coaching. And in 1972, it was like 90-some% of women coaching women's teams on the collegiate level, and now it's 41%. So Title IX has exposed a lack
and about zero in terms of coaches of men's sports.
Right, and women, 0% of women coaching men's sports. So Title IX has also exposed a lack of diversity in the college coaching ranks. Discuss some strategies to increase diversity in the hiring process of coaches and athletic administrators. And I'm sure we have a few students here that are in athletic administration, sport management.
This isn't rocket science, and we know what not to do. The Rooney Rule of the NFL, the Russell Rule, which became somewhat popular in the last few years, they were rules that, in the case of the Rooney Rule, said at least one finalist for every head coach position in the NFL had to be a person of color, because there were no black coaches as head coaches in the NFL. The Russell Rule has been adopted by a very small number, one conference and maybe two conferences. And that rule is a similar one, that the finalist for not just your head coach positions, but your athletic director or senior cabinet positions, those have to have a diverse, so women would come in, not just persons of color, but persons of color and women, any minority population would have to be in that finalist pool. And that's not the answer. The answer, well, the problem is 80% of all athletic directors are white men. That's a problem. And I'm not saying that in a sexist way. I'm saying that we know, research shows that something called homologous replication exists in the world. And that is, we hire people who look like us because we're comfortable with people who look like us. It's that simple. And so this the reason why we see 80% of all ADs as men, and it continues that way over time, no matter how our student body changes, no matter how many women are qualified to take those positions, is because they keep hiring people who look like them. So if we want to change the system, it really takes the person at the top saying a lot of things, but not playing tokenism. In other words, as soon as, before a position even opens, on every college campus, the AD should be saying to each of my senior cabinet members, so Sean, if you're in charge of compliance and you have 6 people working for you, at the end of every year we meet and I evaluate you. I would like to you to show me your report card. What's the diversity of your 6 employees? And tell me what's your succession plan for each one of those employees. And I want to see at least 1 person of color, 1 woman, and then you can have an open category.
So, I mean, it really takes very intentional.
Before you even open a job, you've got to put pressure on the system, because we know, and you have to be the example. If I hire a senior cabinet member who's a person of color, they are going to practice homologous replication, right? They're more likely to hire a person of color. Or if I hire a woman, they're more likely to hire a woman. So you want to set that flywheel in motion. Then when a job opens up, you appoint a search committee that is majority minority. Duh, not a search committee with 1 minority, the tokenism, right? If you want to change the system, you have to have at least 40%, if not 50%, of the minority population that is underserved. We know this, in terms of global research. There are countries who have quotas. Sweden and Finland have quotas that 40% of their legislative bodies have to be female. Can you imagine doing that in the US? It would be a little wild here. But so when the position opens, you have a search committee that is majority minority. You say you do not close this position unless I have a majority of all applicants who are qualified minorities. And you don't advance anybody to finalists unless there's a majority minority into the finalist pool. And it's that kind of numbers that you have to keep seeing, all of them qualified, that are really going to make the difference. But who's going to do that? Not the guys who are now running the show. Right now, the Russell Rule, the Rooney Rule are showpieces. They're not serious change mechanisms of the system.
So you've been an adjunct professor, haven't you, and taught many classes within athletic administration and sport management. So what are you teaching those students? How are you,
This.
You're teaching them this intentionality to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And you have to teach them that it's not a zero-sum game, because half the people in those classes are white men. And you have to convince them, saying, the whole system grows. If you give a job to a minority person, that doesn't mean you're taking a job away from a white person. And you have to be that straight with everybody and have them understand the beauty of capitalist systems. They're always growing. They're always expanding. The population is always growing. Numbers of institutions are growing. So you can't have this mentality of zero sum, which is the rule rather than the exception.
In 1994, you alluded to this, the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act, the EADA. So any one of us can look up a college or university and see statistics in terms of gender equity. Sorry about that. So in 1994, the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act was passed, and so anyone can look up any college and university athletic program and see statistics in terms of gender equity. Do you think that's helped in terms of Title IX compliance?
It's helped in the courtroom, in the sense that that's the data we use to bring cases against schools. But you can't make social change one lawsuit at a time. It's too expensive. It's too time consuming. It's not the way to create change. The policy answer is preferable. Public embarrassment of institutions is preferable. And what Champion Women, which is a nonprofit organization, is doing right now is taking all of the EADA Act stuff, putting it into another database and pulling up easy report cards that are visuals that can be shared on the internet, that you'd be able to say in your conference, in the Big Ten.
That's what Tucker Center has been doing.
Right.
Giving out those report cards.
Right, and Lapchick does report cards also. But it takes a lot of effort, and we haven't reached the social media sophistication of communication yet that is required to really ignite and educate people. It'll happen. They've got some money behind them, and I think they're doing it the right way right now.
So you've been an expert witness, over 30 cases, and one of the more recent case that got a lot of publicity was the Shannon Miller ice hockey suit. What types of questions are you asked?
I'm telling you guys, these court cases, you just have to shake your head. Shannon Miller, I don't know if you've ever heard of Shannon Miller. She was the gold medal ice hockey coach for Canada. She's the best ice hockey coach in the world. She got fired because she was making too much money. I kid you not. I kid you not. The reason that the AD gave was she was too expensive. We had to cost cut. And therefore, we are going to cut the best coach in the whole world on the basis of cost. Can you imagine saying that to Saban in Alabama or any kind of a male winning coach? Come on. And really the reason is in every one of these employment cases is because these are powerful women who bring up Title IX inequities, and they put their institutions, on the, on notice that they're not going to lay down and do this. They're going to say something about it, and the institution starts digging up reasons. This was a bad reason. But what they typically do is they start using student evaluations to go after a woman coach who's too strong. And if you know anything about research on student evaluations, they are not worth very much, because who fills out these evaluations? The people who are unhappy, right? And if anybody fills out your postseason or exit interviews, who's filling them out? The kids who aren't starters, right? That's being too simplistic, right? But kids are not professionals who are qualified and taught to evaluate the quality of coaches. So if there's ever, and I say this to parents all the time, if there's ever a question about the quality of a coach, and I say this as future sport management students, is darn it, you better make sure that whoever's supervising that coach is sitting at every single practice. And what do we know? That the administrators never go to a practice. They're not even looking at what coaches are doing in terms of pedagogy. And that really is a crime, because you and I and everybody in this room can sit there and you know what abusive language is. You know when athletes are in distress and being punished with physical conditioning in an unrealistic way. We know all these things, but you got to be in the room. And you have to call the card of a coach. And that is a big gap right now, that nobody is overseeing the performance of coaches in a very responsible way.
So shortly we're going to open up questions to the audience. Maybe you can answer this. What advice can you give our audience in advocating for equity and Title IX compliance? We have faculty in here, staff, students, grad students, administrators.
I am all in favor of trying to put pressure on systems like conferences, like state high school athletic associations, to adopt rules that require Title IX compliance as a condition of membership. And if you don't want to kick somebody out or require it as a condition of membership, to say you're not eligible for postseason play until you remedy unidentified inequity, or you have 2 years to remedy an identified, figure it out. You could figure out how to make it. Now I know there's a problem that has to be fixed, and here's the incentive system that will make you fix it. We can do all that, and I think it's a very positive way to get involved. Otherwise, if the system is sick, like the NCAA, and it's not going to be responsive, then it's public embarrassment and Title IX complaints, because Title IX complaints are still pretty effective in terms of the government has to come in and they will make the life of the institution miserable. And anyone can bring a Title IX complaint. You do not have to be the harmed party. I can bring a complaint. As a matter of fact, our organization, along with Champion Women, we're probably going to take the top 50 colleges who are out of compliance with Title IX based on EADA and just do complaints on them. Just make people know that you know.
Make them accountable.
Yeah.
So audience, do you have some questions? I think Dr. Murray back here has a question.
Glad you're still kicking, Mimi.
Hey, I'm trying, Donna. I'm just about. Donna, thank you so much for being here. And the rims are gone in East Gym, so you can't go over and make 20 points in 2 seconds.
Are they still against the wall? No.
Yeah, no. But anyway, thank you for being here. Brilliant presentation, as always. And to be at Springfield, we're delighted and honored to have you here. I do have a question for you, surprisingly enough. This one is about, were you at the hearing where Darrell, I happened to be there, was in Congress. Darrell Royal was talking about why the Senate, anyway, should not pass with great force from Tower, Senator Tower, your senator from Texas, and Darrell Royal was testifying why Title IX should not pass. And he finished his whole comment by saying, like a minister, if you passed, this is to all, probably there were 2 female senators at the time, he said, if you pass this bill, it'll be the end of American football. How many years ago was that? And all the senators were like, oh no, we can't have that happen. We can't have the end of American football. Were you there?
I wasn't there, but that's a good example of how it takes an accident of history. It takes a Birch Bayh and an Edith Green. It took a Ted Kennedy. It
Exactly.
took
Bill Bradley.
Bill Bradley, but guys in power with daughters who, and that's what kept Title IX going. That once fathers knew that that they could identify with their daughter on some level. It wasn't the doll level. It was, let's go in the backyard and I can teach you how to throw level, right? This was meaningful to men. Once that happened, Title IX was in like Flynn. Because when all the public surveys were taken some 10 years after Title IX's regulations were released in 75, it was like 72% of the American population in a USA Today. It wasn't a USA, it was probably a New York Times or a Post, some kind of it wasn't USA Today. 72% of the US population said that they support Title IX, even if it meant a reduction in opportunities for boys. 10 years, 1 decade. But that was not because of the laws, because of dads and moms realizing that it was as important for my son as it is for my daughter. And no parent wants to see their children treated unequally. But that was a huge sea change. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. Don, I want to concur with what Dr. Murray had mentioned about thank you for coming to Springfield College. I've been here for a little while, and you have graciously provided your time and your expertise here numerous times, so thank you for helping to educate us on Title IX and many other important issues in sport. I also wanted to reference, you mentioned Shannon Miller. I was fortunate to interview her recently for one of my upcoming webcasts, and she was telling me her story. And when she talked, she said, okay, my lawyer said, okay, who do you want as an expert witness? And she said immediately, Donna Lopiano, of course. So kudos to helping Shannon Miller win that case. So thank you. I do have a question. My question is, where do you see Title IX 5-10 years from now?
I hate to be in the weeds with that question, but, and maybe, I'm hoping I don't have to be in the weeds, but okay, this is the weedy answer to that. When Title IX passed, when you look at Title IX is still 37 words. That is the statute. Nowhere in the statute is the authority to keep separate sex sport. That was in the regulations promulgating the law. And as you saw from how the Trump administration, for instance, handled trying to revise the Title IX regulations, you realize that the authority for separate sex sport is on unsteady ground. It has to become part of a statute. So I really think that that is especially with this Supreme Court, that is a little off. It could potentially be a very significant Supreme Court case. But let me put it in the context of the current issue in terms of transgender individuals in women's sports. There is a way, and a good way, to mandate the inclusion of every transgender girl in women's sports. But it is not to, it is through an accommodation within women's sport if the advantages of a male body are retained, to where now competition against smaller and less strong women is sacrificed for the sake of identical head-to-head competition for transgender girls against cis women or biological women, whatever your terminology is comfortable here. But what's important is that the federal government right now has passed in the House something called the Equality Act. The Equality Act would change the definition of sex from biological sex to gender identity. And it, without making very critical exceptions that Title IX made. And the three exceptions that really have been in place since the 70s have been medical research, recognizing the difference between the biology of males and females and how drugs and everything interact differently in two very different bodies. The second place is pregnancy and pregnancy law. And the third place was the women's sport exception of Title IX, the provision for separate sex sport. We have to solve this problem, right? We have to solve it while fully welcoming transgender girls and women into women's sports. And solving it means really separately scoring. And if you're interested in this at all, I'd be happy to explain it. It gets complicated, but so let me try. Let me try to do it quickly. And here's what you have to understand: that Title IX was never a law that said there shall be equal opportunity in sport for men and women. That will come as a surprise to everybody. It wasn't about equal opportunity. It was about an exception to discrimination law for women. You could discriminate on the basis of biological sex in the case of sport, because you had a class, a very large class, half of the population, who had immutable differences physical differences that would make it impossible if you had a single team and you had to try out, men and women had to try out for that team. Women, as biological females, wouldn't get selected, right? So the category had immutable differences. Put it in your mind like this, that we have another example of that for individuals with disabilities, that we create a category because of their disadvantage. Their sport ultimately depends on a physical test that is fair. A physical test that is fair. That means competition between equally matched individuals. And normally we match all the time, right? Think of wrestling. 120 pound versus 180 pound? No. You gotta do 120 versus 120. We do it with Division 1, 2, and 3. We do it with Class A, B, C. We segment to ensure fair competition. In the case of categories like female and categories like individuals with disability, we ensure that a disadvantaged population in sport, one that cannot compete against an open class, think of either male or open, that they have a place in sport. And then we create this structure for them. Then we create eligibility rules that don't allow the open class to play down, to compete against someone in which they have a physical advantage. In this case, strength, speed, reaction time, whatever. And this is where we are with the transgender situation, because in the case of transgender athletes, their gender identity is not a physical issue. It is a deeply held identity issue that has nothing to do with a sport competition. And we've got to have this conversation in terms of what does sport look like, women's sport look like, if you have fair competition and include everyone in terms of everyone who identifies as a girl or a woman. And let me just say one more thing with that. 95% of sport is social. It's not a physical test. Think about it. Every day you go to practice, every bus ride, number of bottles of beer on the wall, right? Just every bus ride, every team meeting, right? You exist for this social camaraderie between women. That is so damn valuable. And it is just as valuable for a transgender girl or woman to be in that space. And there's no reason to keep a transgender girl or female out of that social women's sports space. And the only adjustment that has to be made, this is called an accommodation, is in scoring, right? In scoring. For instance, you picture the high jump, right? The high jump, I can look at a high jump contest and what do you see? You see the bar goes up gradually and less kids play, right? At the end, picture two classes, like the 120-pound class and the 180-pound class. You give two trophies. And one is for an advantaged girl, woman, and one is for a disadvantaged girl, woman. Biological female versus transgender girl. And you, for those of you who've studied this, and I've spent 3 years on this darn thing, we know, for instance, that even though you can bring down the testosterone level of males through hormone replacement therapy or cutting off testicles, right, or any of these mechanisms, you can bring testosterone levels into the female range. You can do that. But once a male body has gone through puberty, and the benefit of larger lungs, larger heart, larger windpipes, for instance, once that happens, that the legacy advantage remains. We even know now that the proclivity of men because of testosterone to build up more muscle tissue per unit volume of body mass, that is recoverable to a greater extent possible. Once you train as a trans girl or a trans woman, that much of that comes back, so you have an advantage in explosive versus distance events or whatever. This is throwing a lot of facts at you, right? Suffice it to say, there's a solution here. And one more concept that's important. I started with this. Title IX never required equal treatment of women. It never required identical treatment of women. You didn't have to have a women's football team. You didn't have to use the same basketball for women. You didn't have to have the same size net, right? The construct of women's sports is called equitable accommodation. What happens if you want to give a comparable opportunity to a class, fit it for that class, just like sport for individuals with disabilities? The same thing. They adjust the sport to fit sport opportunity for that class. So the concept for transgender girls and women of accepting an accommodation, an equitable accommodation, is the same thing that cis women had to do in terms of accepting a woman's place in sport with sport that looked differently. That was a balance beam instead of the rings, right? Think of the ways we've changed sport to fit, women. And the only adjustment need be in this moment of competition with separate scoring. But we have to work at this. And right now, you've got two extreme sides. You have the Biden administration who says, I don't care. If a transgender girl or woman never goes on hormone therapy, never changes her body, presents with a biologically male body into women's sports, that biological male body should be able to compete, given identical treatment against this physiologically inferior female competitor who was protected, of the protected class. And the suggestion is, there's so few transgender that who cares whether, this shouldn't be important to people. Any of you who played sport know how important it is fair competition is. It's everything. But anyway, we have to work at this, and we ought to talk to each other instead of yelling at each other in order, to make this happen. And right now, everybody's still yelling. We've got 20 states who are passing laws that say you participate in women's sports by birth sex. They do not want trans girls and women to be in women's sports. That's wrong. And on the other side, with the Biden administration, and I love the Biden administration, I'm a Democrat, right? Is they're saying it's okay for a male body to be in women's sports. Sorry, you don't get it. You don't get the whole concept of categories in sport and equitable accommodation. It's like, in the name of social justice, they're willing to throw women's sports under the bus. And if I'm emotional about this, it's because I'm teed off that they're not studying it the way they should. So
Thank you, Donna, because I think it can be.
I'm glad you didn't ask me that question. Sorry.
You have a question?
I just have a comment.
Yes.
So, Donna, we have Paralympics, right?
Yep.
So it is a separate competition for those who are not what they call able-bodied.
Right.
So why can't we have the same for transgender at this point?
Well, it's whether we want to honor, and okay, when Title IX passed in the 70s, no one knew what the word gender and identity meant. It wasn't even coined until 1966. Coined, that somebody identified something called gender identity. For 20 years, it was categorized as a psychological malady. It was something that was for sick people, right? And it wasn't until the late 1900s, really, that gender identity, as we know it today, has become understood. And it's important because it is another example of the beauty of diversity of the human race. There are people who are gender fluid. There are people who are non-binary. There are gay people and lesbian people and all kinds of different people, right? And to the extent that we can be totally exposed to them, to each other, and respect those differences, is critical for cis women, right? I want transgender girls and women to be with the female athlete, not to exclude anybody because of what? Their gender identity?
Physiological, and like you said, the bigger lungs and things like that.
But I'm not saying include them in competition head to head. I'm saying make sure they're in competition in the same event, but it's a separate. So you're running the 800 meters, right? So it either can be 2 scores if you only have one kid in the school district who says I'm transgender and I'm a transgender girl and I'm an 800 runner. You can run, and you can just be separately scored. And if it matters, let's say, somebody says, well, you're going to displace a cisgender girl in the heat, the qualifying heat. Add another position to the heat. Come on, we can figure this out.
All right, thanks, Donna.
Yeah,
Here.
sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Mary Jane D'Souza from Penn State, but my heart is still here at Springfield as
This is
an
good.
alum. I have a comment and a question. I work with female athletes around issues to do with metabolism, reproductive function, bone health, the female athlete triad type issues. You've brought up the notion that sport is more than just this physical competition. And you said it, but I would like to highlight what you said. You said it's a social event. There's camaraderie, there's behavioral benefits. And I think one of the most important reasons, especially for the young girls involved in sport who are interested in transitioning, to preserve their opportunity is key for their overall mental health development. And I think a lot of the limitations that affect mental health are being completely overlooked, and the focus is merely on performance differences that arise from the pubertal growth spurt and what physical differences appear in men, larger lungs, larger blood volume, etc. I've recently been working with some folks that you know. So Carol Oglesby has done a lot of work with the Women's Sport International Group, and they're trying to put together a white paper. So the IOC has gotten wind of this, and they want to take over this project. And I'm wondering what your reaction to that type of a international governing body trying to take over the development of a white paper around trans, DSD, et cetera, et cetera.
The IOC has already opted out of the transgender the eligibility space of transgender athletes. The IOC has recognized that its 10-year-old effort to have a single eligibility rule for all transgender athletes is not you have to look at every event and every sport, and that each of the international federations have to make their own eligibility rules based on their sport and whether there's scientifically proven physiological differences, right? That's where the IOC is. Why are you saying that they're taking over a white paper? How can anybody take over a white paper?
Well, they're promising WSI first class trip to Luzon.
Oh,
I
that
might.
way, okay.
I'll
I got it.
In
I
the
got it.
effort of being polite, I won't elaborate on what they're offering, but they want to change the entire team that was involved in writing these right papers for WSI and have a completely different membership. They've come out with a few papers, which I'm sure you're aware of, and they want to involve, I want to say, FINA in this project. And one other international sport federation. But I've been quite cautious and reluctant to be in the IOC space from other projects that I've been involved with them. And with the notion that you know what they want as the outcome, and it's just a matter of them figuring out, okay, we'll involve all of you in this process, and you're going to let us do it if we fly you to Luzon and you have a first-class trip, and it's loads of fun.
I can't say you're wrong about IOC. The IOC and the I don't want to put the IOC and the NCAA in the same space, but both have a history of non-diverse control, and even their treatment of the women's committee of the IOC, getting rid of women who don't follow the party line, taking off a De Verona and putting somebody else of a choice, which is trying to influence intellectual product, right, or thinking. I think you've raised a red flag, and I think you should follow your gut on it. But right, we're in a very difficult space right now, especially with a number of these issues, and I am grateful that there is no that we're still debating, even though it's volatile. We're still talking about it. We have a lot of catch up for everybody to do in terms of the science behind this. We're just starting to question, for instance, whether any eligibility rules that create an incentive for surgically changing your body or taking hormones, whether there are lawsuits that are going on now for having to deal with that. Boy, do we have to just stop here and put our heads into this. Does any one person have the answers? No. But we all should know what the answer isn't. It's not that extreme, and it's not this extreme. It's some place here, and we have to deal with this new circumstance. And we got to talk to each other to do it, and everybody has to be in the room. It just can't be the transgender athlete organizations over here saying, and cis woman champion athletes over here. It can't be that. Everybody's got to be in the same place, and the science has to be in the room too.
Thank you, Donna. Well, let's give Donna a nice round of applause. Thank you all for being here and celebrating 50 years of Title IX. Thank you.